بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Today I wanted to look at the issue of Imam al-Bukhari repeating his hadith. That's an important issue to understand because we know that when there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, it often comes multiple times. It's not the case that, like other hadith books, you want to find this hadith, it's in this chapter, this book. But Imam Bukhari repeats all his hadith multiple times. That's why it's hard to give a number of how many hadith are in Sahih al-Bukhari, because if you count with repetition or without repetition, because the same hadith could come 3 times, 4 times, 8 times, or 9 times in various chapters, and why is this? So I wanted to look at this issue. Why does Imam Bukhari do that? Why not just put the hadith in one chapter? Like other books, you want to find the hadith on ruqya, you want to find the hadith on praying the 2 sunnahs of Fajr at home, or any hadith you can think of, you can find the chapter in a traditional book. But Imam Bukhari, that same hadith could be in all these various chapters. So why is that? Like, what do you think? Yes, Mustafa.
Because there's so many parts to what the Prophet says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that have so many roots that he's putting those particular narrations and other babs to show how vast that the Prophet's speech was, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah, so that kind of expresses in summary. So Imam Bukhari realizes that you can't capture the Prophet's teachings and just confine them to one thing. That's kind of restricting them. Like if the Prophet said something about honesty, for instance, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-mu'minu la yakzib, the believer does not lie. What part of your life do you apply that to? Is it just one part? No, it applies to so many things. It applies to your business transactions. You could put that hadith in the business section. You could put that hadith in the ethics or character behavior section. You could put that hadith even in the iman section, because if you lie, that's a contradiction of your iman, your faith, because we know actions are part of iman. So it could be in wartime settings. What do you do when you're facing the enemy on the battlefield? How does that teaching of honesty apply there? So there is application of the same teachings in many, many different departments, many different avenues. So a good scholar, not every scholar does that, but great scholars, they recognize that. Imam Bukhari did. And because of that, he's trying to extract as many benefits as possible from every hadith. And that's wisdom. And that is a recognition of the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, his words were jawami'ul kalim. He expressed so much with so little words. His meanings of what he was teaching us was so comprehensive, so wide. It was guidance. So you could take his words and learn so much from them, not just one thing. So to reduce his words to just one topic, one thing, that kind of reduces the scope of the sunnah. So that's Imam Bukhari's vision. So he's trying to do that. And, one way of learning from him and benefiting from him, if you study hadith, you can take one hadith and see, okay, where does Bukhari put this hadith? How many times? So for instance, if you take one hadith, you'll see, well, it comes in Bukhari 4 times. So what you would do is you would take each hadith, read it, see what chapter he put it in, and what bab, what kitab and what bab, what book and what bab. And that'll tell you a lot about what Imam Bukhari is thinking about the hadith. It's also teaching you about what the hadith means, if Bukhari is right. And then you go to the next, the instance number 2 of that hadith. That's in a different chapter, and then in a different chapter. So that's very, very important. But beyond that, it's even deeper than that. Deeper than that, you'll find Imam Bukhari, when he repeats a hadith, it's actually not the same hadith. So when you look at the hadith of well, any hadith, when Imam Bukhari repeats, if you look at the second time he repeats it, and you actually read it, it's actually a different isnad. It's from a different teacher, and it's a different version of that hadith. So you learn more things. Sometimes the hadith is, Imam Bukhari quotes one portion of it. But when you read it in another chapter, it's a whole story behind it. And it's a whole bunch of things that are part of the hadith. More things that the Prophet said. So Imam Bukhari sometimes summarizes the hadith. Sometimes he gives you a longer version. Sometimes he gives you a different version from a different companion. So that kind of, to understand that, you have to understand what hadith is. Hadith is all of us standing at, or all the companions standing at different vantage points from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And each one might hear things a little bit differently. Or he might have missed a word and another companion picked up that word. Just like this class, here we have a very nice audio setup. So even in the back, you hear me well. Most masajid, when I teach, there's, the people sitting in the back, they don't pick up everything I say. And the people sitting in the front, they pick up a little more. And the person sitting on the right might not pick up everything the person on the left says, or the left one hears. And someone who's sitting all the way in the back, like our brother near the door, he might not be fully paying attention. So he might be picking up certain parts. But you might be dozing off, and another student wakes up and he looks at the teacher and he notices something like that another person that's listening might miss. So that's the human condition. We're all in different positions and we see things a little bit differently from the same source. So and that's what the Prophet ﷺ, his sunnah represents. When he was giving the khutbatul wada, the farewell pilgrimage, his last hajj, what was his khutbah? Right? We all hear famous versions of the khutbah. There's no fadl of the Arabi over the Ajami and the black over the white. We hear another version. But when you look in every book of hadith, it's different, slightly different. They all have different details. And some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, but it's the same message. So when you look at all those versions of the Prophet's khutbatul wada in Hajj, you realize, well, it's the same source. We get the message, but the narration of each khutbah is slightly different because if you imagine what was happening, the Prophet ﷺ, he was standing on Mount Arafah. Did they have this back in those days? No. And how many people were there? How many people were there in the last farewell pilgrimage? We talked about that, I think, once. Roughly, we don't know the exact number, but we have an estimate. How many people were there? Are we talking 100, 500, 1,000, 10,000? What's the average number of people that were there in this last khutbah of Hajj? Yeah, it was over 100,000. So imagine over 100,000 companions standing in Hajj. The Prophet gave a khutbah. Did they all hear him? And did they all hear the same thing? No. So what would they do in those days? They would have people relay. They have relayers. So people like slightly in the back, they would hear, and then they would tell their people what he said, and then they would relay that message goes on. So, yeah, they would have different details, but that's why a scholar has to sit back, and even not you as students, when you read the details, when you read multiple versions, you look back and say, okay, you have to see if there's any contradictions. If there are contradictions, then you have to investigate, but usually there are not. In the khutbatul wada, we don't have contradictions. We just have like slightly different ways of saying the same thing. So like if somebody were to ask you what I said, what Abu Zayd said about Ruqya, the hadith of Ruqya, you would explain it to your friend. And then all of you would explain it differently. And many of you would, you know what, Abu Zayd said this. And then the person on the other end wasn't there, was like, whoa. And he would write it down, and then he would do a refutation of me. And then another person would do the same thing. That's what happens. This is real life scenario. But the thing is, those people doing refutation, they weren't there. They're hearing a secondhand account. So the secondhand account might be accurate, but it's not fully. So if you compare all your notes, all the notes of everyone here, and just put them side by side, it's going to be different. Because all of you are comprehending differently. You're putting it in your own words. That's what the companions were doing. They're trying to be very exact. But sometimes changes happen in words. That's natural. That doesn't mean anything. You know, you don't expect like a tape recorder type setup where you're recording every word. Even in the modern age, like when we have speeches, famous speeches, do you know Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address? When we were in school, we used to memorize that, you know, 7 years ago or something like that, right? But do you know, what did he actually say, Abraham Lincoln? So if you check the sources, there are about 4 or 5 versions of the Gettysburg Address. And we don't know which one he actually delivered. You know that? You might think, well, this is the modern world. Now we know he gave a speech. We know every word. We memorize it. No. The words are different. The Gettysburg Address, so what happens is, like, you know, he was probably revising it. He had a speechwriter, and they probably changed some things. And then he had it written down. And then when he delivered it, there was no tape recorders back then, Abraham Lincoln's time. But he delivered it, and then the newspapers probably reported it, and so everyone might have got a slightly different version. And then you have what's written down on paper when he's actually standing there. Like when I have my notes and I stand there, sometimes I improvise, I go off course. People do that. So you have his written one, but what he actually said was slightly different. Now we don't know exactly what he said. I mean, we know what he delivered, the message, what he wanted, but exact word for word, it's not there, even in our times. So that's why people who don't understand hadith, they get very confused. Well, why this hadith says this and this one says that? If you look at it, that's not really a difference. That's how human speech is. Okay? Yes. You know, like some. That's also the same scenario. So in that, you have the version of Abu Hurairah and the version of Ibn Umar. So those versions are, it's the same questions, but the order of the questions is different. And it's slightly different details. So basically, that's a good example where we know what happened. The angel Jibril came in dressed as in white and the whole story, but it was a long story. He sat down, he asked a whole bunch of questions, he acted a certain way, then he got up and left. And then the Prophet didn't say anything for a while. And then after some time, you know, then he explained who that was. But now there's so many people sitting there. So every hadith represents one companion's recall of what happened. And it can never be exact because it's not a videotape. It's a human being. So that's why the details are slightly different. But the issue for us, we need to look at, are there any details that are contradictory? No. It's the same questions. If I say, like, you know, it's hot, and someone says it's warm, is that a contradiction? It's just a synonym. Like, those people remember things different. They might use different words. Nothing extraordinary there. That's how we do things even today. Yes.
I was just thinking as you were saying that I spoke to my granddaughter a couple of days ago, and I told her that I wanted to tell her something that a lot of people don't know, and that everybody is victimized by it. And as you were saying, you know, breaking that scenario down, I was thinking about how I explained it to her. I explained it to her in my words rather than giving her the exact words, but she got the point. She got the point that every night that everybody sleeps, Shaitan comes to them and ties 3 knots at the back of their neck. I said, now the next phone call, I want you to call me back. Tell me what I told you, and I want to tell you how to take the knots loose. So take my money.
Alhamdulillah. Barakallahu. Well, let me give you, so what I want to show you, let's look at the first hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari. You guys should have it memorized. So, حدثنا الحميدي حدثنا سفيان قال حدثنا يحيى بن سعيد الأنصاري قال أخبرني محمد بن إبراهيم التيمي قال سمعت علقمة ابن أبي وقاص الليثي قال سمعت عمر بن الخطاب يقول وهو منبر. So what's the hadith? So this is the first hadith number one, okay? Hadith number one. So what's the hadith? Who has it in front of them? إنما الأعمال بالنيات, right? Actions by intention. إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Is that the word? I'll just summarize. Action by actions. إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Intentions. And you don't got the other colors here. It's okay. Verily actions with intention. وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. Every person, I'll just put every person, gets what he or she intends. And then what's next? فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أو إلى امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. And then number 3, whoever migrates for the dunya or to marry a woman, whoever migrates, his migration is for that which he intended. Is there more? That's the end, right? Okay. Yes, good. So now, this hadith appears about 8 times in Sahih Bukhari. This is the first one, hadith number 1. Now, let's go to the second instance. The second instance of the hadith is Kitabul Imara, the book of leadership, Bab Qawluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, innamal a'malu bin niyya. So this is a chapter, it's hadith number 1907 in the version I'm looking at. But that's a different book. So Hadathana Muhammad ibn Rum ibn al-Muhajir, different teacher. Whole different isnad. But coming down to Yahya ibn Sa'id, all of them. Okay, no, I'm sorry. The second instance, I'm looking at like the 8th instance. The second instance is Kitabul Iman, the book of faith. Bab ma ja'a anna al-a'malu bin niyya. Okay? And that's hadith number 2529. The one I was reading to you is from Sahih Muslim. I had the wrong hadith open. I'm just trying to connect online so I can fix the hadith. So,
Yes, that's correct. 2529.
okay, so what's, can you read that hadith? Sure. Let's go to the hadith, innama, from there.
He didn't say.
Okay.
He said, أعمال بالنيات والأمر من نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته للدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة
يزوجها.
فهجرته إلى ما هجر إليه.
Okay, so now read from the beginning word by word.
أعمال بالنيات.
النيات.
أعمال بالنيات.
No, بالنية.
بالنية.
Okay. So this one, okay, Kitab al-Iman, it's a different isnad. It says, it doesn't say verily first, so innama is not there. So it says actions, a'malu bin niyya, by intention in singular. It doesn't say intentions. The first one said in niyat. Innamal a'malu bin niyat. This one says al-a'malu bin niyya. Actions are by intention, singular. And the word verily is not there. Okay? And then the next, no, after the midniya, and then what's the next thing? فَمَنْ كَانَتْ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Okay. So the second thing is saying every person gets what he or she intends. Okay, I'm just going to the line, it's the same. Number 3, what does it say? Okay, whoever migrates for Allah and His Messenger. Allah and His Messenger. And then the last one, whoever migrates for dunya. That's the same as this. So, in this first hadith, what are the differences? Very small. Actions versus intentions versus intention. Is that a big deal? Does it have change the meaning? How does it change the meaning? Yeah, it doesn't change the meaning because here you're talking about all actions are with their intentions. You're saying all actions are with each intention of the action. Same thing. So then this is the same, this is the same. But then whoever migrates for Allah and His Messenger is not there in Hadith 1. Okay? So whoever migrates for Allah and His Messenger is not there for Hadith 1. Okay? But it goes straight to whoever migrates for the dunya, and then the end is the same. So now if you go to the next one, and then I just want to show you the differences. And then, so if I give you the number, you can look it up. Okay, so that was 2529. This one's 3898. That's the third one, Kitabul Ait. Yeah. It's Kitab Manaqib al-Ansar. Okay. So I got it. My internet's working. So the third place Imam Bukhari repeats this hadith is in Kitab Manaqib al-Ansar, where the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-a'malu bin niyya. Same thing. Actions are with the intention, singular. And then he says, فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا وَامْرَأَةٍ يَتَزَوَّجُهَا فَهِجْرَتُ مَعَهُ. And then at the end, إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. So here, another version has, same as this, right? Number 2 is the same, but then it switches the order. First says the dunya, whoever migrates for the dunya, and then at the end, whoever migrates for Allah and His Messenger. This is what you mean by different versions. So does that change anything? Not really. So that's what human beings are. Like, so you got to understand, why did this happen? When you narrate hadith, these minor things can happen, change through the narrators, like minor things, right? So, but a scholar and student now has to see if there's something significantly different. So far, there's one thing we find significantly different. We're going to come back to that. This detail is missing. But this one has all four. And if you go to the next ones, I'm not going to read every instance. It's about 8 times Imam Bukhari repeats it. All of them have all 4. And the hadith one is the only one that has the 3. And then there's another difference in some of the versions. Some of them say al-amalu bin-niyya. Action in singular is by intentions, plural. And action singular by intention singular. So this word action sometimes comes as a'mal, sometimes comes as amal. And it's, again, not a big deal. And the intention sometimes comes as niyat, plural, or niyya, singular. So this is a good case study to understand what happens in hadith. You know, hadith generally is narrated by meaning, and narrators trying to be exact, but sometimes these things happen. And it's not a big deal. But the point I want to make about this, so there's one thing that's kind of significantly different. So what do you think? So by now you should understand Imam Bukhari, he's a genius. He does everything for a purpose. If he does something, it's for a reason. And if he doesn't do something, it's for a reason. If he doesn't put a hadith in the chapter, it's because of a reason. So that's how you understand Sahih al-Bukhari. Try to get into his mind. So all 8 times that he narrates this hadith, it has the dunya and it has Allah and His Messenger. But the very first hadith, he drops Allah and His Messenger. So what's going on here? What do you think? What are the possibilities? Why is that? It's only in the first. All the other, like 8 times or 7 times, I don't know the exact number, it has all the features. And if you look at other books, Riyadh al-Salihin, Sahih Muslim, it'll have all 4. Must be a reason. Huh? Okay. But I mean, you could still migrate and do things for Allah and His Messenger. I mean, maybe not migrate, but you could do other things for Allah and His Messenger. It's about intentions. But then he does put it there in the other one. So like if he feels that shouldn't be repeated, like then we wouldn't have put it in the other places. Yeah. Uh-huh.
It doesn't reach his criteria.
No, it does. Hadith 1 does. Because yeah, that's why he put it. That's the strongest hadith. Because that first hadith, I told you, so all the 8 times he repeats the hadith is with different teachers, different isnad. This hadith he brings from his teacher from Makkah, Humaydi. And it's a very solid hadith and his best teacher, his favorite teacher. That's why he began with him. And also he wanted to teach us that revelation began in Makkah. Yes.
I don't want to deviate from where you're trying to take us. So I want to ask a question, and if it's not relative to where you're trying to take us, I want to save it for later.
Okay.
I want to know about Am and Khas, because oftentimes, general and specific, oftentimes we see something that I don't know if this is the general or if it's the specific. And that's my point now about is it relative to that?
I mean, it's not relative to the lesson here, but that has to do with the understanding of hadith, the extraction of benefits from hadith, istinbat and fiqh. So, I mean, yeah, that's an important issue when you understand hadith. When you have a hadith, is it something general or is it specific? That's the whole prize, you can say. Like, if it's only talking about a specific situation, then it doesn't apply to us. But if it's speaking to all of our circumstances, then it's general. But that's a separate discussion. That's what scholars do, and they debate over that. Sometimes they'll say, no, this hadith about such and such was only for that time. It's not for us. So, but that's not what we're trying to learn here.
Well, the relative point is that the lady who wanted to get married, that was a specific situation.
So that situation is not in the hadith. You read every single hadith, it doesn't say anything about a lady. It just says generally, whoever migrates for a woman to marry her, for a dunya, if whoever migrates for the dunya, for instance, to marry a woman, he will get what he or she intends. And by the way, this one says yankihuha, that one says yatazawwajuha. So they both mean marry. It's just a synonym. So, like I can say to marry a woman, I could say to wed a woman, right? As a translation. They both mean the same thing. That's what's happening in these hadith. You have synonyms. So that's teaching you that synonyms are there. It's the same hadith. We have to focus on the message, the meaning. And the words are trying to be as exact, but words will spill over into synonyms. That's nothing worrisome there. But the point here, why would Imam Bukhari take out Allah and His Messenger? This key piece of information, there must be a reason, but he doesn't do that anywhere else, 7 or 8 times. One answer scholars give is, well, no, he wouldn't forget. I mean, he wrote that book, and he wrote it, revised it over years. And in all the versions he dictated, it's not there, because it's a written book. If he was just teaching from his memory, maybe you could say he forgot, but this is a written book. So this comes from which teacher? Humaydi, yeah. So one explanation a lot of commentaries give, a lot of scholars give, is that that's how he heard it from his teacher. So that's one possibility, because Imam Bukhari is going to be exact. If he heard it from a teacher that way, maybe that's how he's recording it. So maybe Imam Humaydi made a mistake, if it's a mistake, and that's why he's just being exact. But that explanation is not correct, because Humaydi has a musnad. So we have musnad al-Humaydi. It was discovered. So, and if you look in musnad al-Humaydi, which is all the hadith of his teacher Humaydi, it has all four. It doesn't have it in the same. No. Yes. Every person will get what he or she intended. So it's not that he's relating the way he heard it. That was one explanation scholars gave, but it's not correct. That means there's a reason. He deliberately took that out. So first, let's look at the issue of taking something out. So Imam Bukhari, what he's doing, like he can do, and sometimes he does, he'll summarize a hadith. He'll give you a part of a hadith to prove the point. But it's not the case that every time he has to mention a hadith, he has to give all the details. Like, so he doesn't do that. So some hadith, the same hadith is very long, and sometimes the same hadith somewhere else is only quoting a portion. Sometimes you only quote actions are by intention, you might not quote the rest of it. So that's normal. So that's one thing to understand. People summarize. So like when you tell anybody about what you learned, you're not going to give everything I said from beginning to end. You're going to summarize. And you might give part of a point. That's what we do when we talk, when we give speeches, when we give khutbahs. We summarize. We summarize the story of Hudaybiyah. Just take one aspect of the story just to share something that you're not obligated every single time you teach to say everything about the issue. And you can't have human life like that. We gotta talk to each other. We gotta be real. We gotta summarize. We gotta talk according to the circumstance, according to the people. So Imam Bukhari was doing that. So first issue is this right or wrong? So there's nothing wrong with summarizing the hadith. And companions were doing that too. Sometimes they would relate just part of what they heard, and they knew what the rest of what they heard, but it wasn't relevant to what they were teaching. So there's nothing wrong with this thing, like just giving a part of a hadith, okay? Because it's still the hadith. I mean, it's not. That's what companions did. That's what every great scholar did. So I just wanted to put that out there. There's nothing wrong with what he did there. He's not saying this is exactly what the Prophet said, and he didn't say anything more than that. If he was saying that, then you could say, well, why'd you leave this out? He never claimed to say that. He's just reporting something the Prophet said. And he did say these things, right? But now, so that's one issue. And the second issue, now I want to really understand why he did this, to try to understand why. Any questions on what I said? Yes.
Are those that are teaching or passing on hadith, are they giving us the key to go and verify or fact check, or to find out that the information is correct?
I mean, so that's how are you going to factor? You can't go back in time. So, but there's a process of verifying. Yeah, that process is hadith science. So that process would be like looking at all the versions of the hadith and try to understand. Okay, this companion said it this way. You put everything on the table, you analyze it, and you try to understand things that way. That's the important way of fact checking and analyzing. Yes.
That's the important point that Imam Tirmidhi, he said that most people, they don't know the full narrative because they've gotten the portions have become so famous that they just stop right there. He said, but most people should go and just try to find the full narrative. The second question that I had though was in Mustalah Hadith, what does the second one actually classify as?
Second what?
The second narrative.
This?
Yes, the second one. That every person. Yeah.
Oh. I mean, it's still part of the matan. The whole thing is the matan. I'm just dividing the matan up into 4 sentences. But everything is what the Prophet said from here to here. So it's matan.
Each only before still had the same classification.
Yeah, because it's one single statement, one single utterance. Prophet said that in one time in the khutbah. Um, well, no, Omar said it in the khutbah. سمعت عمر وهو يقول وهو على المنبر سمعت رسول الله. So yeah, all 4 are the same because they're said by the Prophet together. But if you put them all together, what did the Prophet say? He said all 4. But now Imam Bukhari purposely took out the 3rd one for some reason. That's what we're trying to dig into. Must be some reason. I mean, he didn't give us the reason, so we have to kind of make an educated guess. But I think if you kind of look at it, the reason kind of comes out, yeah.
This is all with hijra, basically, or this in general.
It's general, because this is general. It's for everything that you do, every breath you take. But then the second part is hijrah as an example. So when you say general thing, sometimes you give as an example hijrah. So this is the example, this is the general.
The strongest thing I find so far is what Young has said.
Which is, I forgot.
No, I forgot what I asked you about.
He said that the prophet was dead, and that the migration, yeah, they are migrations, but that specific migration, which was the reason why.
Oh, okay, I get it. Now I understand what you were trying to say. Because you can't make that hijrah anymore, that is over. So that's why you could, that's a good possibility. That's very intriguing. I don't know. It could be. But then, if that's the case, then why would he put it here? He did it in all the other hadith. So like, if he didn't put it in any of the hadith and he eliminated, then yes. But why did he put it here and here? I mean, he wrote the book together. So, I mean, he did relate this hadith and this hadith like this in the final.
From the isnad, though, different people gave their, and what time period was it in?
All these go back to the same, this is not a mutawatir, it all goes back to Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari. And Yahya from Alqama, from Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Taymi from Alqama. So there's 4 at the source from the Prophet, Omar, Alqama, Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Taymi, and then Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, just one link. Nobody else narrated it. And under under Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, so many people narrated. So it all goes back to the one chain. So it's not like they're different chains. They're different chains underneath, but the source is the same. Yes, bro. Plural and singular. You know. So, okay. I guess, so the most likely thing, what happened here is if you look at, I mean, to understand why he did that, you always have to put every hadith in the bab and the kitab. So the bab and the kitab. So what's the bab and kitab here? Hadith 1. I mean, the first hadith. I mean, that's who we started with. No, Book of Iman is 2. Book of Iman is the second book. Kitab Bad al-Wahi. So Book of Kitab al-Iman is second. And that's very important. That's a whole nother lesson. The way he put his books is teaching you something. So if Yahya wrote a hadith book, he would start with Kitab al-Iman because Iman is the most famous, is the most fundamental thing. And Imam Muslim agrees with you. He started with Kitab al-Iman. So Imam Bukhari, he's a genius. He says, no, we can't start with Kitab al-Iman. That's number 2. Before Kitab al-Iman, you have to understand where Iman comes from, where revelation started. Remember I mentioned that? So he's the only one who put Kitab Bad al-Wahi first. So he said, first we got to establish the base, where revelation came from. Once you understand what revelation is, there's about 8 hadith in that chapter. Some of them are talking about the types of revelation being difficult on the Prophet, like the ringing of the bell. So he wants to give you an idea what revelation is first. Once you understand that and accept that, and then go to what Iman is. But if you don't even know about revelation, you jump to Iman, you haven't had the base or the foundation. That shows his insight. So this kitab is Bad al-Wahi, okay? But kitab Bad al-Wahi, the first hadith is this. Now, what does this have to do with beginning of Revelation? We talked about that. It really, like, does it have anything to do with Revelation? I mean, directly. I mean, indirectly, everything relates. But
It's showing that our actions start in the revelation of Islam coming to us, that it starts with the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in here. Because those actions that we are going to pursue are the actions that are based upon the revelation.
yeah, I mean, so that's indirect. I'm just trying to see. I mean, you could have jumped to the second hadith. The second hadith is really about revelation. So, I mean, this one is the reason he's doing that. It kind of doesn't fit in the chapter directly, um, but Imam Bukhari, this is not an academic book. He's trying to teach you your deen, right, from beginning to end, starting with the base in the most solid way. And the most important thing for all of us is this whole process of Iman and Amal and pillars and Shahada and learning Hadith. None of it makes sense unless you're doing it for Allah Azza wa Jal. So he has the end goal in mind in the beginning. So the most important thing before we do anything is to check your intentions. So Imam Bukhari recognizes that, and that's why it's so deep what he did, and scholars love that. So even scholars followed that. So many hundreds of books of hadith, they started with this hadith, just following Imam Bukhari in that. It's a reminder, basically, tadkeer, that look, it's about Allah and His Messenger, doing things for Allah. If you don't do anything for Allah, or you do things with the wrong intention, none of everything else will make sense. Kitabul Iman will not make sense. So it's basically like looking towards the end game. End game is the pleasure of Allah, doing things for Allah and His Messenger. So that's why the most important thing he decided to start with, to remind people about the niyyah before getting into everything else. So that's why that hadith is there, the hadith of niyyah. But now, coming to this question, so why he took this out. So imagine, I don't remember the first class we had here, what we talked about, but imagine my first class, I come out to the community for the first time, and I give an introduction. My name is Abu Zayd, I'm such and such, and I give you my credentials, and then I start with, whoever does things for Allah and His Messenger, it will be counted as for Allah and His Messenger. Bismillah, here's the class. Isn't that like bragging, showing off? Like, it can come across as that. Like, so Imam Bukhari, not only is he a genius, an academic genius, but he's also very pious. He has taqwa. He's humble. He wasn't one of those celebrity scholars going around, proclaiming his greatness and things like that. Out of his humility, he gave you this book, right? This massive book. And he didn't know it was going to be the position it enjoyed now. It's the number one book. After Qala Allah and Qala Rasulullah, you have Rawahul Bukhari. Like, Allah put His name next to Allah, the Messenger, then Bukhari. And that's like ijma' of the ummah. That status, no human being has. No human being has that status. Like, so Imam Bukhari became the protector, the guardian of the legacy of the Prophet. But anyway, maybe he was thinking about that, it might happen one day, but so he gave you this book, and everything in there is thought about carefully. I mean, we know, like, I didn't give you a lot of biography of Imam Bukhari, but he said every single chapter heading, every single kitab and bab, just the name of the bab, he thought about it, and he was sitting in the Rawda of the Prophet ﷺ, and he wrote every single kitab and bab, the chapter heading, and after writing each one, he prayed 2 rak'ahs. That's his biography. So he was careful. He was thinking about everything. In the Rawda, the whole thing was authored there, the Abwab. So look at that. And every single one, he made 2 rak'ahs to make sure that he was pious. So someone like that, imagine he puts that there, people would have said, Whoever migrates for Allah and His Messenger, so an example is this, Sahih, Imam Bukhari, he did things for Allah and His Messenger. That's the kind of intentions we need. That's true. But Imam Bukhari didn't want to put his name out. He was humble. Out of his humility, like he took that portion out. Because he just couldn't get himself to do it. That's like, if I give a khutbah or anyone give a khutbah and you say something that, um, Allah praises the people who stand in the minbar because we're standing in the footsteps of the Prophet. And then you give the khutbah. You're praising yourself. The people with taqwa don't do that because you have to humble yourself. And Imam Bukhari had taqwa. So his humility forced him to do that. And that's brilliant if you look at that, the way why he did that. But in other places, it was the first hadith, if we put it there, it might come across as boasting, bragging. So that's the reason. Yes, brother.
Now, if you have a business
Mm-hmm.
and you want to say make Umrah, and you say, well, I'm over there also buy some stuff from my store.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a double intention?
That is, but in that case, about double intention works because Allah says in the Quran, "La junaha alaykum an tabtaghu fadlan min amwalikum." In the verses of Hajj, there is no blame upon you if you seek some benefit in the Hajj. So there's a whole page where Allah talks about al-Hajju ashrum ma'lumat, فَمَنْ فَرَضَ فِيهِنَّ الْحَجَّ فَلَا رَفَثَ وَلَا فُسُوقَ وَلَا جِدَالَ فِي الْحَجِّ. Then in the third verse or second verse, وَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ تَبْتَغُوا فَضْلًا مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ. There is no blame upon you to seek some trade or some fadl for yourself. So in that case, that's one of those, because Hajj is like a very complex pillar. Allah allowed it. So you could say possibly that's one of the few exceptions. But your intention still has to be for Allah and His Messenger. Otherwise, it won't count. You'll just get your business. But you can do that while doing that, right? So you can have multiple benefits. I mean, you come to the masjid, you like being here, but you're doing it for Allah. It's not that you're coming here because you like the vibe in this community. But that's true. But that doesn't take away from. You got to see what takes away from being for Allah and His Messenger versus what doesn't. Yes.
So my question now is, we started though like at 12.
Mm-hmm.
Shortchanged today, and or we going to come back.
Yeah, we shortchanged today, unfortunately. I couldn't wake up, and then there's a lot of traffic too. And also, um, I want this to be the final class for a while because only for next week I have to go somewhere, and then the week after I think is Thanksgiving, or it's 2 weeks before Thanksgiving I have something else, and then Thanksgiving break we have the New Jersey Dawah Conference on the weekend. So like November is a busy month. So let's take a break. So this will be final class, not forever, but because this is last Sunday of October. So then now the next few Sundays are in November. So we'll talk about that. December we should come back, but I don't know if we still need to continue this topic or start a new topic. We'll talk about that, inshallah. Huh? Inshallah. I would love that. Barakallahu feekum.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله